That was a preamble answer.
Right, how did you learn that you and the department were being
yes. So
excluded?
following that, looking at all risks, there's the risk of the use of chemical and biological weapons. On this, I was seeing the intelligence. I mean, Whitehall sources closed down what one normally saw, but I'd always seen the foreign policy intelligence because of the job I was in. And I knew that the intelligence agencies thought Saddam Hussein didn't have nuclear, would if he could, but he was nowhere near it. And there were probably laboratories and people trying to have chemical and biological, but it wasn't saying there's some new imminent threat. So I was reading that. But if we were contemplating war, there would be a risk of the possible use, and then our job was to think about the Iraqi people. If it was used, is there an antidote? Could we do anything? So we asked for a briefing, and we normally got briefings from defence intelligence, like on the Sudan war and whether, either side could win and things like that regularly. And this just didn't come.
So these exclusions were specifically with regard to Iraq. You were being briefed on other humanitarian issues around the world, on the intelligence side.
I'd had close working relationships with a lot of the military over Sierra Leone, Kosovo, Bosnia, East Timor, and so on. No problems. But suddenly we couldn't get an answer. And at that stage, I didn't know why. Is it inefficiency? What's the problem? And then also, if you're preparing for all eventualities, and given the fragility of the situation in central Iraq, that all the sanitation and water, electricity systems were poor, and the UN system was reporting that, who were providing food for the people of Iraq under oil for food. We needed to talk about, if there was going to be military action, what kind of military action, what kind of targeting, was there a risk that sewage systems and water systems and electricity systems would be destroyed, which I think happened to a considerable extent in the first Gulf War.
And you, sorry to interrupt.
So, no, again, I was asking for a meeting about the strategy, and again, we couldn't get it. So it started to become clear there was some kind of block on communications.
And what did you then do to break the block?
Well, it was also extended to the intelligence agencies with whom we also had continuous relationships. Of course, at the end of the Cold War, they were desperate for new tasks and were shrinking, and they wanted to help us with Africa and used to come and see me quite a lot, the various seas, to say, please let us help, kind of. So it was that kind of relationship. And then suddenly, I wasn't allowed to talk to them. About what was going on, what were the risks, and on that I made a fuss, and David Manning, who was then the foreign policy advisor in Number 10, in the end, I think, having spoken to Tony Blair, said yes, we could talk to the intelligence agency. So by then it was clear that there was some kind of block on communications. Normal communications were being closed down.
And then after David Manning gave you this assurance, did the situation change? Were you satisfied with your access to the intelligence?
Well, I had a couple of meetings with C, and I still was seeing the paper intelligence. I think Number 10 didn't know I saw that, or I think that would have stopped too.
When did the Prime Minister himself become aware, and how did he react? Did you have any direct contact with him to get for greater access, particularly to the military planning?
Well, I had, as I said, the meeting with him in July when I asked for it to come to the Cabinet, the discussion in Mozambique.
Had they given you the access, these discussions? Had they led to the access you wanted?
What tended to happen was then when one made a big fuss, some unblocking happened. We got, in the end, a paper on the risk of the use of chemical and biological weapons, which said it was uncertain if there was a long standoff around Baghdad, it might happen. There wasn't really an antidote that we could get anyway. That paper did eventually come. You've probably seen it.
Right.
And of course, everything that's happened since makes me know that there was deliberate blockage and there were all sorts of secret private meetings. And all the normal systems of Whitehall are that meetings that might be relevant to your departmental responsibilities will always be minuted, and those minutes will be circulated. Phone calls with other ministers internationally or President Bush would normally be minuted in a letter and circulated. All those things closed down. So the normal structures of Whitehall communication started to close down.
And raising your concerns in Cabinet was not an option?
I raised my concerns at Cabinet repeatedly, but what we had at Cabinet were little chats. They weren't decision-making meetings. So Tony would say, well, Jack, you've been to see Colin Powell, and that had all been in the press anyway. Why don't you tell us how the meeting went? So Jack would make a few jokes, as he does, and so on. There was a meeting, the first meeting of the Cabinet after the summer. People did, obviously having read the press, sort of said, this is dangerous, what about the Palestinians, can't we do that first? A number of people said things, so people sort of got their worries off their chest at that meeting. And Tony reassured and don't worry, nothing's been decided type remarks. And then thereafter, the discussions at Cabinet were little chats about what had been in the media that week. There was never, and I think this is a very serious machinery of government question that is for the conclusions of what went wrong. There was never a meeting. I think it should have been Defence and Overseas Policy, because they're all the chiefs of the Defence Staff and SIS and all the permanent secretaries, as well as the secretaries of state to do with foreign affairs come. There was never a meeting that said, what's the problem? What are we trying to achieve? What are our military, diplomatic options? We never had that coherent discussion of what it is that the problem was and what was that the government was trying to achieve and what our bottom lines were. Never.
My last question relates to timing. By the time, as we see from the documents, by the time that you and your officials were being given full access to the military planning process, that was already well advanced. Do you feel that you had enough time, once you had become privy to the military planning, enough time to make the type of dispositions that you needed to make from DFID?
I don't think anyone had enough time. Don't forget that none of us knew when it was going to start. There was no imminent threat. There was no reason why it had to be as quick as it was. So we were good at, and still are, I'm sure, good at, funding UN agencies. I mean, people don't understand this about DFID. We don't have thousands of people who come over the hill to do humanitarian things. We fund the international system, put in more expertise and extra money. If something's failing, we have a unit that gets the feedback. And we could do that quite quickly, and we're very good at it. So we started to put money for preparations into the international system, including the ICRC, the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And of course, the UN had something like 1,000 Iraqis employed inside Iraq distributing the oil for food, because something like 60% of Iraqis were dependent on that food, and so that network was all over the country. So we could quite quickly put in place the arrangements for emergency humanitarian responses, and that bit worked. I mean, I see Tim Cross said there wasn't a humanitarian crisis. That was because this was working. The ICRC were fixing up electricity and sewage when it got damaged, and otherwise we would have had cholera, and the hospitals were being looted in Baghdad, and we were saying, please get to Boyce, please get Franks to protect the hospitals or protect the ICRC supplies. So I simply want to say the humanitarian thing worked because a lot of work was done by a lot of people, and we played our part in that.